Britannia has laid siege to the world. They have almost encompassed a third of the world. In 2010, they attacked Japan using humanoid-powered forces called the Nightmare Frames to take the island nation by force. Their power far outweighed Japan, so they dominated their defenses and took the country under their territory. Then they gave the island a new name, Area 11, and renamed its citizens 11s. 7 years later, a Brit boy who loathes his own country and family decides to take it upon himself to reclaim Japan and defeat Britannia. His story starts when a group of extremists put their plans against their colonizers into action. They stole what they thought was poisonous gas from the Holy Empire of Britannia and are currently on the run from their military forces. Meanwhile, our protagonist, Lelouch Ramproche, and his friend, Rivals, leave their school grounds to play chess with noblemen. Lelouch wins brilliantly against his opponent and leaves early. However, they encounter trouble on their way back to school. The extremists have attracted even more attention to themselves when the third Prince of Britannia and Steward of Area 11, Clovis, decided to announce their acts. Clovis then disappeared through his general, Ospreus Bartley, that these Japanese extremists had stolen a top-secret bionic weapon of his, so he decided to send the military and Nightmare Frames. The extremists were short on time, so they had to get out of sight fast, and that's when they encountered Lelouch and Rivals, before making a hard turn that resulted in a crash. Lelouch sees the scene and decides to help, but he gets pulled into the vehicle transporting the weapon, and the extremists continued on the chase. Meet Statfield Karen and the driver, Nakata. They are part of a secret extremist organization trying to reclaim their nation from Britannian Empire. Karen decides to cut the troops on their tail, so she gets into a Glasgow model of the Nightmare Frames and begins combat. However, she gets met by an even stronger opponent who pilots the Sutherland model. He overpowered her Nightmare Frame, so she had no choice but to run for cover. Meanwhile, Nakata ends up in the damaged Shinjuku slum and gets stuck. General Bartley then instructs the troops to sweep the slum and find their weapon. So Lelouch gets mistaken for an extremist and attacked by an honorable Britannian, a Japanese citizen who joined the British Army to make ends meet. He later discovers that it's his childhood friend, Kururugi Suzaku, with whom he grew up for a while. He explains the situation. Then, a girl pops out of the case that was supposed to be housing weapons. They get confused by this, but they don't get enough time to think it through because Suzaku's commanding officer arrives and asks him to kill Lelouch and the girl. However, Suzaku declined, so they shot him instead, giving Nakata enough time to blow up the vehicle and Lelouch to escape with the girl. Then Prince Clovis becomes very impatient, so he asks them to destroy the Shinjuku slum and its inhabitants to find his weapon. Then they corner Lelouch and the girl, but she saves his life and makes a contract with him. She grants Lelouch the power of kings called the Geass, which allows Lelouch to command his enemies to do anything he asks them to do. So he makes the call and asks them to end it themselves. Afterward, Lieutenant Knight Nu Villetta arrives at the scene and finds the officers dead. So she asks the student before her his identity, and Lelouch lies that he is the son of a duke to get her to step out of Nightmare Frame. His powers cannot work unless he sees the person directly, so he asks Villetta to hand over the Sutherland to him, and then he joins the battle, leaving Villetta stunned and amnesiac about the events that happened a moment ago. Meanwhile, Count Asplund Lloyd and his assistant, Cecil, rescued Suzaku from the slum and inform him that a pocket clock has saved his life. They required a pilot for their new Nightmare Frame model, the Lancelot, so they asked Suzaku to do it. Suzaku is not permitted to become a knight, so he is initially doubtful but later accepts and enters the fight. Then Lelouch calls his friend and student council member, Finette Shirley, to tell him what was being reported on the news, and it seems Britannia was masking their massacre by calling it a traffic block. So Lelouch decides to start his brilliant plan for domination. He gets in touch with Karen and instructs her successfully on how to evade her pursuer, Commanding Officer Gottwald Jeremiah. Then he connects with the extremists' leader, Ougi Kaname, and gifts them Sutherland models on a nearby train. So they pilot the Sutherlands, and Lelouch directs them to victory. He corners the enemy troops in all spots and breaks their advance at all at once. So Prince Clovis has had enough of the scheming mastermind behind Eleven's confidence, so he asks Lloyd to send out Lancelot and destroy the enemy troops. Consequently, Suzaku heads out and performs brilliantly in the Lancelot, destroying the extremists' newly acquired Sutherlands and almost apprehending Lelouch. He couldn't, however, because Karen protected Lelouch just in time before ejecting out of the battle herself. She ends up trapped in a warehouse with the others, and some Shinjuku survivors, when the Britannia troops find them. However, they couldn't deal with the finishing blow because Prince Clovis put out a retreat order and asked the troops to treat all injured personnel in the slum, be it Brits or Elevens. And he did this because Lelouch made his way into the prince's cockpit, threatening to kill him before then introducing himself as his brother. Lelouch Lamperouge was a former prince of Britannia, born to Queen Marianne, and also the seventh in line to the Britannian throne. His mother was slain at the royal court, while his sister, Nanalie, lost the ability to walk and got blinded by the trauma. He asks Clovis about his mother's murder using the Geass, but Clovis is completely in the dark, so he just kills him and leaves. The next day, Lelouch attends his student council meeting with his president, Millay Ashford, and the others, Rivals, Shirley, and Nina. He finds that Britannia is hiding Clovis's death from the general public, and also discovers that Karen goes to his school. Karen is apparently a sickly student from the wealthy noble family of Stadfield, and this was her first time attending since resumption. So, Lelouch decides to approach her and uses his Geass to ask her about the Shinjuku. He then confirms that she is indeed the same pilot from the day before, and tries asking her to keep silent about Shinjuku. His power, however, does not work a second time, leaving Karen suspicious of him. Later, Lelouch returns to the student council lounge, where he lives with his little sister Nanalie and their maid Suyako. He got housed by the chairman of the board of directors, Millay's grandfather, and lived like a regular student while hiding his ties to royalty. The next day, he decides to test his Geass and finds that it only works once on one person, so he calls Karen out to rid her suspicions of him. And fortunately for him, Millay thinks he called Karen to the student council so that she could join them. She arranges a party for Karen, who finally becomes splattered with wine and ends up in a bathtub situation with Lelouch. Karen then decides to put Lelouch to the test to see if he was the one who had ordered her around before. But Lelouch was already ahead of her because he had to use his Geass on Suyako earlier to make a call to Karen. He had recorded a message on the phone as the person who instructed the extremists earlier and set up a meeting. So, Karen's suspicions of Lelouch get dropped before they can learn of the Prince of Clovis's death and Suzaku's indictment. Suzaku got arrested by the purist faction of the military. They are a faction that believes only purebred Brits should be in the military. They do not appreciate the Elevens being on the same playing ground as them. Commander Jeremiah leads the purists and investigates Suzaku, only to discover that Suzaku is the son of Japan's former prime minister, whom Britannia had vanquished. They found Suzaku's fingerprints on the gun Lelouch used, so they went off on that one piece of evidence and sentenced Suzaku to death. Meanwhile, Lelouch sets up a meeting with Ogi, Karen, and some other members of the extremist group and introduces himself as Zero. He says he will help them go beyond extremist acts and actually defeat Britannia himself. However, they don't trust the fickle words of a masked man easily, so he decides to prove his power to them. He then tells them he is going to rescue and save Suzaku Kururugi. Later, Jeremiah calls in reporter Reed Dythard to cover the parading of Suzaku on the highway before his execution. Meanwhile, the remaining Japanese military forces in hiding, the Liberation Front, notice Suzaku because he is the son of their dead prime minister. They ponder whether to rescue him, but General Tudou Hiroshiru decides against it. But at least they recognize the efforts of the extremists they fund to go against Britannia when they hole up in the mountains. Later, Zero puts his plan into action with the help of Ogi and Karen. He approaches Jeremiah on the highway and announces himself as Zero. He then asks that Jeremiah trade Suzaku for what they thought was a poisonous gas, and having been part of the previous mission, Jeremiah recognizes the poison case as a way to hold all these people hostage. He thinks long enough that Lelouch gains on him and uses his Geass to command him to let them go with Suzaku. So Jeremiah releases Suzaku under the command of the Geass and fights his subordinates who try to get him back. Then Zero announces that he killed Prince Clovis. He takes Suzaku back and asks him to join his cause, but Suzaku detests his ways, so he rejects the offer. He plans to change Britain from inside, not from the outside. For the last Prime Minister's son? That's pretty ironic. Anyway, Suzaku returns to the Purist, but gets exonerated due to a lack of evidence. And Jeremiah gets ostracized by his peers because Zero called him orange. They all assume the term indicates he was bribed and collaborating with extremists. But that isn't the case, since Lelouch merely made up the word to mislead the enemies. Even Jeremiah's memory of his act was lost, so there was nothing to go on. And that's exactly why Britannia sent Princess Cornelia to Area 11 to quench the Zero problem. Meanwhile, the girl who granted him power visits him and introduces herself as CC. She doesn't really say much about the power she's given Lelouch and leaves him to figure it out on his own. But at least she tells him that she is on his side against Britannia. Later, Suzaku gets released from jail and meets a lady named Yuffie. She introduced herself to him as a transfer student leaving the country soon and asked him to escort her to Shinjuku slum. There they find the deceased inhabitant's graveyard, and Suzaku reveals his goal to end the war and unite both nations. Afterward, they get pulled into an altercation between knights in nightmare frames. The Purists were trying to kill Jeremiah because they thought he was a traitor, but Yuffie puts an end to the fight and reveals herself as Euphemia, the third princess of Britannia. She then reports the situation to her older sister, Cornelia, who seems to be craving an altercation with Zero. Even more so when she begins fighting extremist organizations in the area of Area 11 to find him. Meanwhile, Suzaku enrolls in Lelouch's school and contacts him. He says Euphemia told him to enroll in a school since he's still 17, so Lelouch takes his old friend home to see his little sister. And Nanalie was glad to see that Suzaku was doing okay. They lived for a while with the Kururugis after they got banished from Britannia, but their stay there ended during the war 7 years ago. Although they hadn't seen each other since then, they were still very fond of each other. However, Suzaku asks that their friendship be kept a secret from the school so as not to risk Lelouch's identity getting discovered. But their secret later comes out after they were both involved in a wild goose chase around the school, and Lelouch had asked to put Suzaku on the student council. Later on, Britannia holds a burial ceremony for Prince Clovis. The Emperor of Britannia and Lelouch's father, Charles, then gave a daunting speech that proclaimed that his son's death was evidence of the nation's great power and advancement. He had conquered half the world, so there wasn't really much to worry about a bug. Whereas Lelouch recalls confronting his father about his mother's death, about which he was nonchalant. He even decided to send Lelouch and Nanalie to Japan to use as bargaining chips. Later on, Cornelia decides to smoke Zero out, so she sniffs the extremists at the Saitama slum and creates a scenario similar to that of the Shinjuku slum. She then announced the time her operation would start to challenge Lelouch. However, Lelouch gets stopped by CC, telling him not to accept her challenge because she cannot afford his death. But Lelouch threatens CC by pointing a gun at his head, so she lets him leave but decides to keep a close eye on him. Lelouch contacts the extremists at Saitama and instructs them as he did in Shinjuku, and Cornelia notices that Zero is hard at work there. So she asks all the troops to retreat to smoke out Zero, and Lelouch, underestimating her, falls for her trap and retreats with the other Sutherlands. Then Cornelia asks them to open their frames so she can see their faces. This shakes Lelouch and has him on edge until CC arrives dressed in Zero's attire and saves the day by distracting Cornelia's forces. She then escapes through the sewers with Lelouch and tells him to do better next time. Meanwhile, Shirley gets jealous of Karen because she thinks Karen kissed Lelouch earlier, but that wasn't the case, so Karen storms out. Shirley then explains to Suzaku how she fell in love with Lelouch, with Millet listening in on their conversation. Later, Shirley, Millet, and Nina go on an expedition to the Sakura Daita Convention Center. Sakura Daita is Japan's strong global resource that creates materials for Britannia and boasts higher than many other materials. So because of this, the Japan Liberation Front picked their time to strike and hold multiple hostages in the Sakura Daita Convention Center in exchange for their demands. However, Cornelia pays their demands no attention and sends nightmare frames to the building through an underground tunnel. On getting there, they discover that Japanese Liberation Front has placed a powerful defense cannon to halt any Nightmare Frame's advance. However, the Liberation Front present were those under Colonel Kusakabe of the former Japanese army. Tudo had nothing to do with this callous act. And at the same time, Lelouch is appalled by this. He invites the extremists from Shinjuku to their new hideout, a 3-story automobile, and tells them that they are heroes of justice moving on and not a resistance. He discovers that Euphemia is one of the hostages at the convention, so he goes in with his team and they steal a news reporter's car to get in. He then meets Cornelia and tells her to let him pass because he will save Euphemia. He knows how close his stepsisters were, so there was no way Cornelia would refuse him when she knew even her enemies hadn't learned of Euphemia's presence. However, that doesn't last long, because Euphemia helps Nina from harassment by announcing her title and asking to see the man in charge. But by the time she arrived, Kusakabe had already been killed by Zero, and he told her he killed Clovis because Clovis was a son of Charles. Then Suzaki's Lancelot goes through the tunnel and defeats their defense successfully, only to get there late and find Zero and an explosion. Zero then broadcasts a message to Japan announcing his group as the Order of the Black Knights. They will aid the weak and fight the bullies. So that's precisely why he killed Clovis, because Clovis ordered the deaths of innocents. He then releases Euphemia and the hostages and disappears with his team. Then the Black Knights started getting recognized all over Europe and Asia. They punished the bullies that the law could not touch. However, there's a new kick in town. It's called Refrain, and it takes people back to the past when their lives were still good. So many Japanese got hooked on Refrain and started wasting away. And this included Karen's mother. Karen is half Brit and half Japanese because her mother slept with a Brit. However, her father hasn't been to Area 11 in a while, so her mother has been placed as a maid in his home. Subsequently, Karen is disgusted by her mother's weak demeanor and inability to do anything. She doesn't understand why her mother would rather remain a maid in the mansion than go live her life. But she soon finds out when she spots her mother at a kick testing site on Refrain. She almost cost their team the operation because of her shock, but she steadied herself and finished the mission before rescuing her mother. However, Karen's mother gets sentenced to 20 years in jail for using Refrain. Karen realizes that her mom stayed in the mansion all this time because she wanted to be with her. So Karen swears to take Japan back and asks her mom to wait for her. Meanwhile, Cornelia leaves Area 11 for a short while to destroy the Chinese Kyosho route and promises to fish out Zero on her return and make Euphemia the country's steward. Jeremiah and Valletta also resolve to investigate the student Valletta saw before she lost her Sutherland and her memory. They go to Dithard and ask him to join their investigation. Plus, Dithard sends a proposal to join the Black Knights. Later, the Kyoto group sends the Black Knights and new Nightmare Frames, and Zero awards Karen with the Gurren Type 2 model, a magnificent Nightmare Frame with a nuclear pulse emitter. And Lelouch Zero takes the team to Narita. It's the headquarters of the Japan Liberation Front and the place where Cornelia had already made plans to attack. Tudo of the Liberation Front was currently away from there, so Cornelia and her troops basically laid siege on their enemies and pushed them back. Then Zero finally announces to the team that they are at Narita to capture Cornelia. At first, there were complaints, but Zero shuts down those complaints when he asks them to shoot him if they can escape the situation without him. He waits for Cornelia to push back the Liberation Front troops, then initiates his plan by creating a landslide down the mountain and wiping most of their units out. Then he comes into contact with Jeremiah's unit, whom Karen easily overpowers. Afterward, Tudo and his group join the attack on Cornelia's squad, which leaves them cornered on both sides. Cornelia's knight, Gulliford, then asks Cornelia to go to the next point of their plan while they hold back Tudo's squad. However, Lelouch already saw through Cornelia's plan and had already laid the Gurren in wait for her. They ambush Cornelia and are about to capture her when Euphemia allows the Lancelot to go in and protect her sister. Suzaku's Lancelot and Karen's Gurren then engage in a fierce battle that results in Suzaki's slim win because the Gurren fell off the mountain. So Zero asks them all to retreat, and at the same time, Cornelia asks her forces to retreat too. But she instructs Suzaku to go after Zero. He does, and then corners Zero, about to make an arrest, when CC appears and disrupts his mind by showing him disturbing images from his past. CC then becomes immobile and asks Lelouch to run, but he decides to stay and leave with her. So he eventually takes a peek into CC's dark past and realizes she's probably immortal. She falls unconscious, so Lelouch holes up in a cave with her and learns her real name through her dream whispers. They have their first ever bonding moment, and both acknowledge each other's help so far. Then Zero calls Karen to help him out of Narita Mountain. The next day, Cornelia and Britannia officials stationed in Area 11 have a meeting to solve the extremist problem. Meanwhile, the Kyoto group also has its meeting and decides to reach out to the Black Knights for an official meetup. Shirley later invites Lelouch to a concert, but her plans shift when she gets summoned to Narita Mountain to identify her father, buried under the debris made by the Black Knights, along with many other people. Then the Black Knight's inner circle begins to lose faith in Zero, since he continues to hide his face and did not tell them anything during the Narita operation. Later, they meet up with the Kyoto group representative, but it happens that they set a trap to reveal the person under the mask. They told Oogie to lift the mask, only to find CC under it. And then Zero made a threat against the representative, Kirihara Taijo, so that he could get closer and show his face only to him. It then turns out that Kirihara recognizes Lelouch from when he was first sent to Japan 8 years ago, so he laughs and rejoices that the seed he planted 8 years ago has been starting to bear fruit. He had trained Lelouch's wits and had taken care of his sister during their stay at the Kururugi mansion, so he asks Oogie and the others to trust Zero, because he will guarantee them victory and receive the full backing of the Kyoto group. Afterward, Lelouch rushes back to make the concert with Shirley when he finds her in the rain and weeping. She asks Lelouch why Zero killed her dad, even though he claimed to support the weak. She then seeks comfort with Lelouch and kisses him for what seems like forever. Yes, guys, that's the end of the first part of our Code Geass recap. Please hold on for the second part and leave a comment if you enjoyed this video. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video. Peace out!